Finishing up lesson 14C, in verses 66 through 72, we see the denials of really when Jesus was denied by Peter 3 times. And here at the very end on pages 6 and 7 of your little outline class material, it says, beginning of verse 66, this is the King James Version, and as Peter was beneath in the palace, there cometh one of the maids of the high priest. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, And thou also wast with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew, the rooster crowed. Verse 69, and a maid saw him again, and began to say to them that stood by, This is one of them. And he denied it again. And a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. But he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man of whom ye speak. And the second time the cock crew. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him before the cock crowed twice, Thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept. And so we see here that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times now here. The first denial was to this maid of the high priest. Likely this was a servant, a cousin of Malchus, Malchus being the one who Peter cut off the ear. It says here in John 18:26 in your outlines, one of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? See that right there? So she was there too. Think about that. So this is why Peter's probably nervous here and denying Jesus 3 times, because here she is saying it at least 2 times, perhaps more, saying, Look, this is the guy who was in the garden. He cut off my kinsman's ear, likely a cousin. Some translations say kinsman, cousin, things like that, relative. You cut off my relative's ear, is what she's saying. Or at least, this is the one who, because she saw him do it. You're that guy that cut off my cousin's ear, you see. And so that's what's going on here. This is probably why he's denying Jesus, because he's like, oh, you saw me in the garden. You were there. He may not know if they were related or not, but here's someone who saw him. This is why she's kind of instigating this. A second denial he made to a maid here, verses 69 through 78. And then the third denial, there's several people there. They that stood by, if she's amongst them. This may have been 3 times she's instigating people. Based on John 18, verse 26 says, one of the slaves, servants, relatives, or not relatives, but slaves or servants of the high priest being a relative said that. And so, and this was the 3rd time it's recorded here in John 18. So likely she's kind of instigating people 3 times through this. If it's not out of order, she does it once, does it twice, does it thrice. Stirring people up 3 times. I think this is the one who cut off my relative's ear, you see. Then, of course, with the 3rd denial, we see that Peter cursed and swore. Think about that. He's going so far as to not even be careful with the way he talks. And here he was in the garden not that long ago, going out and striking off the high priest's servant's ear. And now here he is cowarding, lying, denying Jesus 3 times, going so far as to curse and swear at this point. We see that, of course, your speech giveth you away. Galilean accent. You see, he was a Galilean. It's like, oh, you're from Jesus' hometown. You're from Jesus' home region up there in Galilee. You had to have been a follower of Jesus because you're a Galilean. We can tell by your accent, you see, the way you talk. Luke records that there was a certain time when the Lord turned to Peter after Peter denied him the 3 times. And it says the cock crew, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Some of the movies, I don't know if they're accurate or not, but some of them describe Jesus as either being kind of led away at this point, or maybe he's being beaten and mocked right there in the courtyard. We're not exactly sure, but it says that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So that's when Jesus turned to him. I mean, just imagine, here's the guy you just denied. You said you would never deny him. And now he's turning to look at you after you've done it the third time. That's where Peter's sitting right there. Any questions or comments on that? A lot of things going on here. We used to, of course, see that when he thought thereon, he wept. That's the last part of chapter 14, verse 72. He wept. He realized he did the very thing he said he would not do. He said he would remain faithful. He said that he would be willing to die for Christ, and he didn't do it. He didn't do that. He was, at least not at this point in time. He just denied Jesus 3 times. He said, "I will not deny you." You're telling me I'm going to deny you 3 times. I'm not going to do that. And yet, that's exactly what he went and did. Of course, on the concluding paper here, we see all these things we saw in Mark 14 listed here. Of course, you see that the plot to kill Jesus was done in cowardice and deceit. They were trying to figure out how to do it in secret, and they did just that because Judas helped him. The precious ointment was an example of love and sacrifice for the Lord. You remember when Mary did that? Judas betrayed Jesus for a bribe. We read about, he agreed to betray him for money. Jesus obeyed the Passover even though he knew his death was approaching. We see Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper as a memorial. His prayer in Gethsemane showed a humble, submissive attitude towards God. The high priest and those with him could only convict Jesus based on lies because Jesus was innocent. You see, he was innocent, and yet this high priest, and that should not be capitalized there. I apologize for that. But those who were with the high priest and him, remember what they said? They were bringing up all these false witnesses. He'd been saying this, he'd been saying that. They were saying, they brought up the lie that he had said, if you tear down the temple, I will build one in 3 days, rebuild it in 3 days. Almost like as if it was a threat. And yet we even read back earlier in chapter 14 that even with that being the case, that was a lie. Because you look at John 3, he was talking about his body. But through all of this, he ended up saying nothing. With all these false accusations. Matter of fact, it even says there in John 14 that those people that were bringing up that whole clear down the temple situation, that false witness, they're lying about that. Even their testimony didn't agree with each other. It was contradictory. Again, all these false witnesses. And that's the only thing they could base a conviction on when it came to trying to convict Jesus of being guilty of death. And that brings us into Mark chapter 15. Are there any questions or comments on chapter 14? Yes.
In John's account, he goes into a little more detail.
Yeah.
Like chapter 18, when he talks about Peter warming himself on fire.
Yeah.
Charcoal fire. He warmed himself with the officers and some of the servants. And so Peter denies Jesus 3 times. But the interesting thing is after that, after the crucifixion, and Peter says, I'm going to go fishing, right? They do. And Jesus again appears to them. They don't know it's him at the time. And he tells them to cast the net on the other side of the boat to catch all these fish. And Peter begins to realize it's Jesus, and he jumps up and he runs to the shore, And it's at that moment that John tells us again that Jesus has built a charcoal fire.
Yeah.
And it's at that charcoal fire again that he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Yeah. So there's 2 events in the Gospel of John before this charcoal fire. One where Peter denies Jesus, and one where Jesus has an opportunity to ask Peter 3 more times, do you love me?
Yeah.
Feed my sheep.
Yeah. Very similar situations too, because you bring up the charcoal fire and them being around the charcoal fire when he brings that up. So it's kind of interesting right there. Any other questions or comments on chapter 14? Getting into chapter 15 now. Chapter 15 is going to focus on the cross. They're going to bring Jesus before Pilate. He's going to be tried before Pilate. Jesus is going to be abused by the soldiers before his death. He's going to be crucified. And it's going to talk about those who stood nearby, those women who had followed him. And then, of course, the body of Jesus, the body and burial of Jesus is going to be mentioned here. Looking in chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. Does anyone need a copy of Mark 15, lesson 15? Getting into Mark 15, beginning in verse 1, it says, "And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away, and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answering said unto them, Thou sayest it. And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing." Now think about that for a moment. Remember all those false witnesses? They're probably here right now before Pilate. But it says, Art thou the king of the Jews? He answered, Thou sayest it. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them, that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude crying aloud began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people, that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answered and said unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him whom ye call the king of the Jews? In other words, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Verse 14, Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out the more exceedingly, Crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to contend the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. And so we see a bunch of things here taking place. Mark's account kind of condensed a lot of things that take place. You can read more detail in Luke and also John's account of the events surrounding the crucifixion. They give a lot more detail. You have Jesus actually appearing before Pilate twice. One of the times he's going to end up going to Pilate, and then he's going to go to Herod, and then he's going to go back to Pilate, according to Luke's account. There's more discussion between Pilate and Jesus in John's accounts. Jesus talking about how my kingdom is not of this world and things like that. There's a lot more discussion and detail in those two accounts. But here it condenses all of this and kind of summarizes what happens. In verses 1 through 5, of course, Jesus is being accused before Pilate. Here in the outline, he said he was the king of the Jews. He asked him if that was the case. He agreed. He said, "I am." When you continue on, he did not open his mouth in his own defense toward these people who were making accusations, which, of course, fulfills a prophecy in Isaiah 53, verse 7. Can someone read for us Isaiah chapter 53 in verse 7? The entire section there, the entire chapter of Isaiah 53 deals in depth with the crucifixion of Jesus and the death of Christ. There's a lot of things there in 53 that are all a prophecy concerning Christ. Matter of fact, the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 was reading from this section, from that particular section, when he was when he met Philip, the evangelist. Again, someone read for us Isaiah 53, verse 7.
He was oppressed, it was afflicted, because he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is sought for its shearers. So he did not open his mouth.
See that right there? He did not open his mouth. He didn't open his mouth in his own defense. Why would that be? Of course, it would be to fulfill that prophecy.
He knew what was going to be done.
Yeah. He knew he was going to be crucified. And, even think about this. Their testimony, I mean, just look at some of this here. They're lying about him through all of this testimony. I mean, he marveled, likely because most men would try to defend themselves if they're being accused of a lie. And the chief priests, it's almost obvious that they were lying. Again, these false witnesses were brought before Caiaphas. Possibly these same false witnesses were here. Once again, giving a contradictory testimony. One accusation was that Jesus was trying to rival Caesar, kind of oppose Caesar as another king. Someone read for us Luke chapter 23 in verse 2. This was one of the accusations you can see here in Luke chapter 23 in verse 2.
And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and say that he himself is Christ the king."
And so he's trying, look, here's this guy trying to claim to be king. He's trying to rival Caesar here. We have no king but Caesar. Can someone read for us verse 14 then of that same chapter, Luke 23?
Says unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth people. And behold, I have examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accused him.
That's Luke 23:14. I may have got a couple verses mixed up there. Someone also read for us John 19, verse 12. John chapter 19, verse 12.
And from henceforth Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If thou let this man go, thou art not treat me friend. He tried to make himself a king, speaking truths against Caesar.
So what are we seeing here? Well, what's Jesus being accused of according to all these passages?
They think that he wanted to take over Caesar's job.
Yeah. Yeah, they're accusing him of trying to start a revolt. They're accusing him of trying to rebel against Caesar and become a king in opposition to Caesar. That's what they're accusing him of. And they're trying to bring that before Pilate. And if you actually read John's account, Pilate's going to actually question Jesus himself. And he's going to say, that's not at all what's going on here. Especially after he hears the phrase from Jesus, my kingdom is not of this world. You see. Any questions or comments on that?
And that's what makes Jesus' response to Pilate all the more suspicious to the average person, is that his kingdom is not of this world.
Yes.
And so the average person in Pilate marvels at this, that Jesus is not groveling in his own defense. But Jesus turned, kind of the norm upside down. He would say things like, you've heard it said that you should teach your enemy, right?
Yeah.
So Jesus turned all that on his head. And the interesting thing here is that the Jews would very often take the law into their own hands. We see that with Stephen. They don't go to Rome. They just stone Stephen.
Yeah.
There's no trial or anything. They just stoned him to death. But here they're trying to use Rome to do this because they knew that Jesus had the crowds on his side. They feared that. And the reason they find themselves in this situation is they're focused on basically nationalistic things. They're concerned more about the land and their place there than anything else. And we see that because they're going to ask for Barabbas to be released. He has been found guilty of everything almost that they're accusing Jesus of.
Yeah.
And the crowds are there basically because they want to release him. They know Pilate's going to release someone on that day. And that's why most of the crowd is there. It's to kind of petition for Pilate to release Barabbas because he is a hero.
Yes.
He's a hero.
Yeah, to them he would be a hero because he's revolting. He's causing causing trouble for Rome. That's not what Jesus did. And so they think, we want maybe Barabbas is the real Christ. That may even be going through some people's heads. But just notice what he is. He's a murderer. He's a rebel. He's a insurrectionist. Just these three different things that describe him. Like, yes.
And the Jews would use one word to describe him. That's patriot.
Yeah, he'd be patriarchal for the, not patriarchal, but a patriot for them. So Pilate, likely thinking that they wouldn't want Barabbas. He may not be thinking very clearly on this, but they would think, oh, well, we're not going to want Barabbas. Barabbas is a murderer, insurrectionist, revolter, all these things. I'll offer him Barabbas or Jesus. Well, that backfired, it seems like. Pilate thought he could have Jesus released if he paired him up with someone who was worse, someone who was actually guilty of something. And they called for Jesus to be crucified. The people wanted Barabbas as opposed to Jesus. Pilate caved, according to number 5 here on the outline on page 3. Pilate caved to having someone innocent killed. Pilate was likely doing this for political reasons and cowardice. He had already made the Jews angry. I mean, history tells us that he was someone that the Jews really didn't like that well. He was always kind of hard to describe it, but the Jewish historian, Josephus especially, doesn't talk very highly of him. Matter of fact, he had Galileans killed. That's in the Antiquities of the Jews. It records that. And so he may have done this, just finally allowing them to have Jesus killed, mainly for his cowards act. They were maybe it was to appease them after he had done that. You see, and here's the reason why they were mad about the Galileans being killed. Galilee was under the jurisdiction of Herod. And so they thought, here's this governor here who's not a Jew. He's a Gentile, this filthy, uncircumcised Gentile coming in and going into Herod's territory. Of course, Herod being a Jew. And so that may have had something to do with it right there, why they were so angry. You're getting into Herod's jurisdiction. And so they're still probably sore about that. And instead of releasing an innocent man, he agrees to have him crucified for him. In political reasons, a coward's reasons, things like that. Any questions or comments on that? Of course, Jesus was scourged. This was done with cords, with nickel and bone fastened, according to what historians often talk about. Often just being scourged would kill a person. And if they survived being scourged, they died of infection. Many died of infection days later because internal organs would be exposed. You have something sharp just, whacked on your back until the Roman soldiers got too tired to do it. Well, that's going to leave your back scarred up and people are going to see stuff that shouldn't be exposed. So that ended up happening. And I think we can even see that by the fact that Jesus couldn't even carry his own cross. If Jesus wasn't scourged, he may have been able to carry it. But because he was, that points to the fact that he had been scourged up hard enough to where he couldn't even carry his cross. Looking into verse 16, any questions or comments on that before we get into verse 16? Continuing on into verse 16, it says, "And the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole band, and they clothed him with purple, and plaited a crown of thorns, and put it about his head, and began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they smote him on the head with a reed, and did spit upon him, and bowing their knees, worshipped him." Sarcasm right here. "And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, and put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him." Maybe some of those soldiers were actually believed what the Jews were saying about him trying to rival Caesar. Verse 21, "And they compel one Simon a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross." Of course, likely referring to this Alexander and Rufus might be Christians that people would have known back in that time. We see, of course, here in this section, Jesus is abused by the soldiers shortly before his crucifixion. He's mocked. This purple, we've talked about purple and red and scarlet, and those kind of colors were colors that royalty would wear. And so that's what they're doing. They're putting this purple robe or cloth on him, these purple, basically clothes on him, whatever it is, a cloth or a robe, and they're mocking him. They're making him, and they're like, hey, you're a king now. Look at you. We got purple on you. We got a royal collar on you, you see. And then, of course, the crown of thorns, doubtful that they just kind of said, let's just gently put that on your head. Very doubtful. They would have pressed that onto his head. We see, of course, sarcastically called King of the Jews. Struck on the head with a reed. In Matthew 27, verse 29, this reed that we read about, this like stick or staff, some translations say, was used in mockery to make him look like he had a king's scepter. Look at you. You got a scepter like a king, and you got a crown around your head, and you got that royal robe on you. Look at you, you see. And then they spat on him, mockingly bowed down to him. And then, of course, after that, they would lead him away to be crucified. Just imagine, that's after the scourging. I can't imagine him standing up through all of this, barely standing up through all of this. Simon of Cyrene carried the cross, pointing to the fact of that harshness that scourging would have been. This wasn't just a couple whacks on the back, if you will, from a horsewhip. This was something that made it impossible for him, physically impossible. If other things may have been able to take place, but from being beaten like that and having all those, again, that being scourged with all those different things, leaving internal organs exposed and things like that, he wouldn't be able to carry that cross. You'd see. Any questions or comments on that?
Notice that Rome does all their trial in the name of
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rome. This is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah.
You're going to be just like this person. And it tells us that Simon, bears the cross for Jesus. We see a lot of people today who kind of have the idea that Jesus is carrying an entire T-shaped cross, and that's not the case. Historians make it very clear that largest pole, the cross itself would weigh somewhere around 300 pounds, all assembled. But the victim would carry that cross member, just the one bar, from the place there all the way to the heel where they'd be crucified. It wasn't the entire cross like some people doing today. And so Jesus is at the point that he's weak and he needs assistance, even carrying that part of the cross, which would probably weigh 75 to 100 pounds, which is a lot of weight for someone in his condition.
Oh, yeah.
To carry. And, the Romans was very good at bringing a person to the, real close to death, not quite there yet, so they would suffer tremendously.
Yeah.
So that's what they do with Jesus here, is get him as close to death as they can. Then they're going to take him out here and make him suffer even more until he dies on the cross.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. There's a lot of things that happen in this next section, though. Verse 22 says, and they bring him unto the place called Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull. This may have been where they've done previous crucifixions, and this may have also been a place where that was kind of close to where they buried, people that were too poor. If you were poor in Jerusalem, they had a specific spot. If I recall, they may have actually, and I might be wrong on this one, but they may have just threw you in the dump, basically. They either threw you, if you were too poor to afford a tomb, it was either a dump or they had a specific pit for people who had died. I can't remember which one of those it was. But that's what ended up happening. He's brought to this place called the place of a skull, Golgotha, and they gave him to drink wine mingled with myrrh, but he received it not. And when they had crucified him, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them, what every man should take. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. And the superscription of his accusation was written over the King of the Jews. And with him they crucified two thieves, the one on his right hand and the other on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads and saying, Ah, thou that destroyest the temple and build it in 3 days, there's that lie, save thyself and come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking, said among themselves with the scribes, He saved others, he cannot save himself. He cannot save. Let Christ the King of Israel descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. And they that were crucified with him reviled him. And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That's Aramaic right there, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, Behold, he calleth Elias, Elias being Elijah. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink, saying, Let alone. Let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. So a lot of things going on there. The soldiers gave him wine with myrrh. Wine, I don't know if this would be to make him drunk or not, or to make the myrrh taste less bitter, but myrrh, some translations say gall, was a bitter herb that was used as a kind of a painkiller by Roman soldiers for people being executed on a cross. That's something to think about there. They would use that as a painkiller. To think that they would actually give him a painkiller, you know, that seems kind of odd. But at the same time, it was maybe something that was, they saw him scourged, maybe participated in his scourging, and they're looking at him. Maybe they're seeing he can't even carry his cross. Maybe this is them thinking, maybe we ought to be a little more merciful. You think about this idea of pitying him so much to give him a painkiller. That's probably what's going on here. Rather than thinking, oh, we're not going to give you the painkiller, they're thinking, he's beaten up. He can't do that. We'll try and give him a painkiller. And yet we see Jesus didn't do that. He didn't drink it at all. He not only died, but allowed the full pain to encompass him. The full pain of everything, the scourging, the cross. Someone read for us Proverbs 31-7. I wanted to bring this one up. Someone read for us Proverbs chapter 30. My apologies, that should be chapter 31, verses 1-7. Oftentimes we talk about the Proverbs 31 woman. Well, there's actually a section that comes before that in reference to a guy by the name of, I believe it was King Lemuel, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. King Lemuel, and he's being instructed by his mother. Now, the big long bulk of that chapter talks about how he needs to find, who to look for in finding a wife. But before that, in verses 1-7, she was given him, this was some of her advice to him.
The words of King Lemuel, and oracle that his mother told him. What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and provoke the wrath of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those who are in distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more.
So what we're seeing there is God would allow drinking of wine as a painkiller before death. Someone's in pain before death, wine could be used as a painkiller. Well, Jesus is being offered wine, and on top of that, a bitter herb that would be something myrrh, gall, that would be a painkiller. Well, why would he reject that? Think about that. Why would he reject a painkiller? He's going through all this. He's been scourged. He's traveled up to Calvary. He's been up all night. That's another thing people don't talk about. He's been up all night. He's been up since they arrested him the previous night. He hasn't had any sleep. It's been, likely 12. He's been up for quite possibly 24 hours by this point or more. Why would Jesus refuse a painkiller?
It goes back to the statement of when he talks about this cup, let this cup pass from me.
Mhm.
Jesus is going to bear the entire cup, not part of it or not some of it, but all of it, and that includes the pain
Yeah.
that comes along with it. And that's the reason that he's in great agony. Here in this chapter, it starts out saying that they led him right to the crucifixion place, but by the time they get there, it appears from the language that they're carrying
Mhm.
to lead him there, and maybe carry him there, because the language has changed. It says they brought him to the hill. Jesus is a very, very weak man, and even amongst everything that he suffered, he still refuses anything that's going to numb the pain, because he wants to bear the entire cup of the Father sent him to bear.
Yeah. Yeah, very, very good point there. He's bearing the entire cup. He's not accepting anything that would ease the pain of the cross or the scourging or anything else he's been through. Even think about this. If a person is drunk, if this made him drunk or drowsy or something, he might say something from the cross that he's not supposed to. Seeing all those people mocking and reviling him. Of course, he's the perfect, sinless, spotless Lamb of God, of course, but he might be tempted to say something. And then drunk, I don't know what being drunk would do, but that's just something to think about there. But when you're going through this, he took it all sober. He took the entire suffering sober. You read what it says here in the outline after letter A on page 5. The soldiers cast lots for the clothing of Jesus. That's a prophecy fulfilled from Psalm 22:18. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Casting lots was done for various reasons. Sometimes it was done among the Jews to figure out God's will. Among Gentiles, it was a gambling thing. Matter of fact, I think even sometimes the Jews would even gamble in that particular way. I'm not sure what kind of thing this was. They talk about in the book of Proverbs, the law is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. That's about the only description I could think of what casting lots may have looked like. But that's what it says there. Jonah also talks about casting lots and the lot falling to Jonah. However that works. But again, Psalm 22 details also the suffering of Christ. We see the third hour, likely, and this is important to understand. There's people that try to make this idea that there was a contradiction in the scriptures. People look to this and they say, well, this says the third hour that Jesus was crucified. And then you go over to John chapter 19, chapter 18 and 19, it says that Jesus was, that Pilate said, behold your king on the 6th hour. Well, that's a contradiction. Well, no, it's not. And here's how we can look at this. Here's how we can understand that. John was written to Gentile, with a Gentile perspective in mind. Third hour here, likely a reference to the Jewish calendar. Not Jewish calendar, but Jewish way of telling time. Remember, we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but sometimes when you read the Bible, with Gentile and Jewish perspective, who's being written to in mind, whenever it talks about the Jewish perspective, they would start an hour beginning from 6 a.m. A day starts at 6 p.m. You see, they would go evening and morning. You remember this maybe in Genesis 1, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. You see that throughout Genesis chapter 1 and also chapter 2 also, I believe. But you think about that. And there was evening and there was morning. Begins at 6 p.m. The morning, or no, excuse me, the evening would consist of 6 p.m. They would count that to 6 a.m. Then the morning would consist of 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. You see, 6 to 6, not 12 to 12, not midnight to midnight, like we would count it today. Now, that's how the Gentiles would look at it, midnight to midnight. That's not what we're seeing here. Here's how it works. We're seeing Jesus crucified at 9 a.m. That's what it says, the third hour of the day, 9 a.m. When Pilate said, "Here is your king," and he put him in front of the Jews there in John's account, that would have been 6 a.m. You see, according to the calendar, it was the 6th hour, it says. Starting from 12 a.m., goes to 6 a.m. And that is something I wanted to bring up too, because it's not long after that Jesus gets crucified. Because when you're reading John's account, it just brings you from that into the crucifixion pretty quick within the next few verses. And that almost, you think about everything that Jesus has been through at this point, the scourging, almost like maybe it took 3 hours from Jesus just to get from Jerusalem to Golgotha. Think about that. That probably would have been a less amount of time journey. I mean, Golgotha is just right outside the city. It took Jesus 3 hours just to get out there, or about 3 hours approximately, give or take, whatever time it took to. You see what I'm saying there, though? It took him that long. That's how badly that scourging left him. Think about that. 3 hours to get somewhere, perhaps only taking 1 or 2 hours, maybe less than an hour to get to for anyone else. But that scourging left him so badly hurt, left him so badly, his body so badly damaged, if you will. Took him 3 hours to get there. That's something to think about there. That's the suffering that Christ went through. Any questions or comments on that? Yes.
There's a lot of prophecies being fulfilled in this short little stint of Mark's gospel, along with the other gospels at the crucifixion and leading up to it. And one of those that's very important is this casting lots for his clothing. And John goes into more detail about that in John chapter 19, verse 23 and 24. It says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier. Also his tunic. See, it was separate. But the tunic was seamless, which is unusual, right? Woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture which says, now look how specific the scripture is in Psalm. They divided my garments among them, which they did, and for my clothing they cast lots. Right? So they fulfill that, all because he has a unique tunic.
Yeah.
They don't want to tear. There's 4 of them. They don't want to tear it into 4 pieces, so they cast lots for this unique tunic.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you think about that, because well, wait a minute, why are they even doing that in the first place? They may have, dividing his garments, maybe they're they need usable clothes. It could be the fact that maybe they can use his clothes to patch up their clothes. Just a few thoughts there, but you think about all that stuff that went on. You have the inscription over Christ's head. It's almost sarcasm. Here is Jesus, King of the Jews. That's what Pilate put. Matter of fact, it was either Luke or John's account. The Pharisee says, don't put that over his head. Put that he claimed he was the King of the Jews. And he said, what I have written, I've written. It's interesting. When you think about it from that perspective, it's almost like as if I don't know, maybe he understood something. Maybe it was the fact that he was upset that he had crucified an innocent person. There's a lot of things that could be involved in that.
And
Yes.
one of the things we're overlooking here is that very often, all right, Jesus is led away, and they're dividing, casting lots for his clothing. So what does he have?
Yeah.
Right. And so normally, in most circumstances, a lot of people were crucified completely naked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the case with the Jews, very often it wasn't that way. They would permit them to wear a loincloth. Right. And it was done usually naked to humiliate that person even more at the point of death. But because of certain things and maybe some sympathies or empathies, they allowed probably Jesus to wear a loincloth. And that's all he had on
Yeah.
before the crowd. And in that culture, he would still be considered naked, right? To
Yeah.
just have a loincloth on in public. So it's still humiliating.
Oh
So
yeah.
they have his clothing, they divided it among themselves, and here he is in just a loincloth.
Yeah. Yeah, for all we know, this may have been, maybe they understood Jesus's mother is there, and it's like, well, we don't want to do that in front of his mom. That could have been something too. A lot of things could have contributed to that. They could have been, they maybe thinking back to Noah, him covering his shame, needing to be covered by his sons, and his sons walked backwards to cover him up. It could have been a sign of just what little respect they still had for God and His Word. Thinking back to that, thinking, well, can we at least have that part covered? Just something to think about there. But all of this goes back to all the suffering that He went through. Who even knows what temperature it was outside? We do read at 9. It says at the 6th hour from the 9th hour, which would be for Mark's account, that would be a 12 to 3 p.m., noon to 3 p.m. There was darkness over the land. What about when he was crucified at 9 a.m., the 3rd hour, 9 to noon? The sun may be bearing down on him, it being hot outside and things like that. That could have been something. But it just all goes to show you all the suffering that he went through, including his clothes being separated from him. Any questions or comments on any of that? Yeah.
And it's in mind too, the Romans didn't crucify Romans as
Yeah.
this was reserved for the lowest of the low, criminals, Jews, other folks besides Romans.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's their view of Jesus, that he's the lowest of the low. He's crucified with common criminals. And,
Yeah.
this is something we should take to heart. It's what the cost of our sin was. All these things
Yes.
we're reading about Jesus and the stuff he suffers here. If you look at it, watch some videos sometimes of some physicians who explain exactly what takes place during crucifixion.
Yeah.
It will break you to what
Oh, yeah.
Jesus went through here, and he's done that for you and I.
Hmm.
We should live every day knowing that he suffered all this that we read about to redeem us.
Yes. Yes. So much suffering that went in on that, and I mean, it's interesting. It just says they scourged him. You know, you think about now they would have understand. Okay, a Roman scourging, yeah, that's bad. Us today, we read that phrase unless we study the Roman scourging, and we study what all went involved with being nailed to the cross and things like that, and all the suffering one person went through. We're going to see this towards the end of chapter 15, Lord willing, next week. But Pilate was surprised that Peter, or not Peter, but Jesus had already died. Because usually a person is hanging there for days, sometimes hours, days. That's why they had to break the legs of the 2 thieves next to him, so that way they wouldn't be hanging there on the Sabbath, and that way they wouldn't have to remove them from the crosses on the Sabbath. But that's a lot of stuff we'll get into, Lord willing, next week. Are there any questions or comments before we conclude tonight?